That night in Bethlehem was unlike any other, not just because of the star shining brightly in the sky, but because it was the moment when three men, guided by something far greater than themselves, entered my humble world. Their gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, seemed, at first glance, like mere valuable objects. However, each one carried a secret, a divine message about who I was and what I was destined to become. This is the story of those gifts, their hidden meanings, and the eternal impact they had on my life and on all those who understand them. The night was quiet, but the silence was not ordinary. It carried a weight, an expectation, as if the entire sky was about to move. Inside the stable, the faint light of the lanterns barely illuminated the wooden beams and the piles of straw scattered on the ground. Mary held me in her arms, while Joseph arranged the few belongings we had. There was a serenity in their movements, but also an evident weariness. It was then that the three men entered. Their garments, so different from anything that Mary and Joseph had seen, shimmered under the flickering light. They seemed out of place in such a simple setting, yet their steps were firm, as if they knew that this was the destination they had been seeking. When they saw me, their expressions changed. There was no doubt, only a silent reverence. Mary instinctively held me closer to her chest, while Joseph took a step forward, his gaze a mixture of curiosity and caution. One of the men, the eldest, spoke first. "We followed the star here. We brought gifts for the promised king." There was a moment of silence, as if the words needed time to settle in the air. Mary looked at Joseph, and he nodded. Then the men knelt. The first man opened a golden container. The glow of the gold filled the space, reflecting off the rustic walls of the stable. Mary blinked in surprise, but before she could speak, the man said, "Gold for the King of Kings." The second man stepped forward, opening a small vial. When he burned its contents, a sweet and heavenly aroma spread throughout the space. Mary closed her eyes, as if the scent transported her to another place. "Frankincense for the Son of God," he declared, his voice laden with respect. Finally, the third man brought something smaller, but no less significant. It was myrrh, with its dense and bitter aroma. As he opened the vial, he looked directly at Mary, as if he knew that his words carried a greater weight. "Myrrh for the one who will sacrifice himself for many." Mary remained silent, but her expression changed. Something in his words unsettled her. Joseph watched intently, but did not ask questions. After a moment of quiet prayer, the men placed their gifts before me and left. Later that night, Mary broke the silence. "Why myrrh?" she asked, looking at Joseph. "It's used for bodies. Perhaps it's just something of great value to them, Mary. God has his reasons, even if we cannot understand them now," Joseph replied, trying to comfort her. But the mystery of the myrrh stayed with her, a forewarning she could not ignore. Gold has always been fascinating. Even in its simplicity, its shine carried a promise. Since that night, it was kept as a special treasure, not because Mary or Joseph valued wealth, but because they knew that this gift had a deeper meaning. "A gift for a king," Mary would often say, holding it in her hands. But what did it mean to be a king? When I was young, that idea seemed strange. Our life was so humble. I helped Joseph with his carpentry, learning to turn wood into something useful. There were no crowns or thrones in my childhood, only tools and the hard work of a carpenter. One day, while working alongside Joseph, I asked, "Why did they bring gold for me? I'm not a king, am I?" Joseph paused for a moment, reflecting. He looked at me with a warm smile, but there was a seriousness in his tone. "You are more than a king, Jesus. But the kind of king you will be, that is something I don't fully understand either." These words stayed with me. Years later, when I entered Jerusalem riding on a donkey, surrounded by crowds shouting, "Hosanna to the Son of David," I began to understand. To them, I was the king who would bring political freedom, who would overthrow Rome and restore Israel. But my kingdom was not of this world. The gold taught me something important about leadership. Just as the metal is refined in fire, a true king is shaped by service and humility. My reign would not be marked by earthly conquests, but by love and truth. I remember one moment in particular. While praying alone on the mountain, I looked up at the starry sky and asked my Father, "How can I be a king if the world does not understand the kind of kingdom I came to bring?" The answer came in silence, but it was clear. The gold from the Magi was not just a gift. It was a proclamation. I was the promised king, but my throne would be a cross, and my crown would be made of thorns. When Mary held the gold in her hands, she would sometimes murmur, "One day, everyone will understand." And I knew she was right, but that day was still far off. Frankincense always had something sacred in its essence. From the moment its fragrance filled the stable that night in Bethlehem, it seemed to bring with it the presence of the divine. Its sweet and penetrating scent never left me. It was as if it had been engraved in my soul, a constant reminder of who I was and of my eternal connection with the Father. Mary, as always, tried to understand the meaning behind the gift. Once, while cleaning the small vial the Magi had left, she reflected aloud. "Incense is something we burn in worship. Why did they bring this to you, Jesus?" I, still a child, did not have a clear answer. But the idea that my life was tied to worshiping the Father began to take shape early on. Years later, on the day of my baptism in the Jordan River, I understood a little more about what that gift meant. When John immersed my body in the cold waters and I emerged, I felt something extraordinary. The sky seemed to open up, and the Father's voice echoed, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." That declaration was not only for those present, it was for me as well. It was a reminder that my mission was rooted in constant communion with the Father. At that moment, the scent of the incense seemed to be all around me, invisible, but undeniably present. The incense, I discovered, was more than a symbol of worship. It was also a call to intercession. Just as the smoke rises to the heavens, carrying prayers, my life would be a living bridge between God and humanity. Every word I spoke, every miracle I performed, was like the fragrance of incense, rising as an offering to the Father. But the incense also carried a weight. It reminded me that this divine connection was not without suffering. Being the bridge meant feeling the weight of human pain, carrying it in my prayers, and interceding for those who sought redemption. There were nights when this burden seemed overwhelming. I remember praying alone on the Mount of Olives, feeling the weight of the crowds who came to me seeking healing and hope. Their pain was real, and their doubts were sometimes heavy. But each of my prayers was like incense, rising as an offering of love and intercession. Incense was, therefore, a constant reminder that my mission was rooted in communion with the Father and in love for those He sent me to serve. Myrrh always had a different weight. From the moment it was placed before me on that night in Bethlehem, it seemed to carry a dark message, a prophecy that Mary and Joseph could not ignore. "Why myrrh?" Mary once asked, looking at the small vial with a worried expression. "It's used for bodies." Joseph, always calm, replied, "Maybe it's a symbol, something that points to what is to come." These words stayed with me. Myrrh was bitter, and its scent was strong, almost heavy. It didn't have the shine of gold or the sweetness of incense. It was a gift that spoke of death, of sacrifice. As I grew older, I began to understand what it meant. My mission would not be easy. There would be suffering, and it would be an integral part of the plan. Myrrh was a reminder that the path to redemption was marked by sacrifice. This became clearer in the Garden of Gethsemane. The night was dark, and the weight of what was to come was almost unbearable. I fell to my knees, my breath heavy, my heart racing. The words that left my mouth were almost a cry. "Father, if it is possible, take this cup from me. But not my will, but yours be done." At that moment, it seemed as though the scent of myrrh was all around me, a reminder that suffering was necessary. I knew what was coming. I knew that each blow, each insult, each nail piercing my flesh was part of the plan. But that didn't make the weight any easier to bear. When I was taken to Golgotha, myrrh returned in another form. Mixed with wine, it was offered to me to ease the pain. I refused. Not because I wanted to suffer more, but because I needed to feel everything. Every moment of pain was part of the sacrifice, and every drop of bloodshed had a purpose. Myrrh was not just a gift, it was a prophecy. It spoke of death, but also of the redemption that would come through it. The moment I gave up my spirit on the cross, I knew the promise had been fulfilled. Later, when my body was taken down from the cross and prepared for burial, it was wrapped with myrrh and spices. The bitter scent once again filled the air, but this time it did not only carry death. It also brought with it the promise of resurrection. Myrrh taught me that suffering could be transformed into something glorious. It reminded me that pain, when surrendered into God's hands, can lead to redemption. The Magi, men who crossed deserts, guided by a star and a conviction they could barely explain. They were not Jews, they didn't know the scriptures like the scribes of Jerusalem, but they carried a certainty in their hearts. They were in search of something greater than themselves. I imagined their nights under the starry sky, debating the meaning of that unusual light. It was Melchior, the eldest and wisest, who first spoke with conviction. This star is not ordinary. It announces the birth of a king, but not a king like the ones we know. Balthazar, pragmatic as always, hesitated. What if we're wrong? Leaving everything for something so uncertain. Gaspar, the youngest and most impulsive, replied, "But what if we're right? A king like this deserves our reverence, doesn't he?" And so, with faith and courage, they set out. The journey was not easy. The days were scorching, the nights freezing. The path was full of uncertainties. At many moments, doubt haunted them. But the star never left them, shining as a constant reminder that they were on the right path. When they reached Jerusalem, their search seemed almost over. They sought Herod, believing that a king born in Israel would be widely known. But the encounter with Herod was strange. The king, with a calculated smile, listened attentively and replied, "Go to Bethlehem. Seek the child, and when you find him, return to tell me, so that I too may worship him." Herod disguised it well, but the malice in his words did not go unnoticed. As they left Jerusalem, the Magi spoke among themselves. "There is something wrong with that man," said Balthazar, frowning. "He's not interested in worship." Melchior agreed but simply said, "Our mission is to follow the star. It will lead us to the right place." And they continued. When they finally reached Bethlehem, what they found was surprising. There was no palace, no crowds, only a humble stable. But upon entering and seeing Mary holding me in her arms, they knew they were before the king they had been seeking. Without hesitation, they knelt. The setting didn't matter. The divine presence was undeniable. They offered their gifts, the gold, proclaiming my kingship, the incense, recognizing my divinity, and the myrrh, anticipating my sacrifice. That night, in a dream, they were warned not to return to Herod. Without question, they obeyed, taking another route back to their lands. This simple decision saved my life and allowed God's plan to continue. The Magi taught me something important. Obedience does not always come with clarity. They did not understand everything, but they trusted. Their faith made them part of something much greater than they could have imagined. The gifts the Magi brought that night in Bethlehem were more than symbols. They were prophetic declarations about my life, mission, and the eternal impact I would have on the world. The gold, with its unmistakable shine, proclaimed my kingship. But it was not a kingship like that of earthly rulers. My kingdom would not be defined by castles, armies, or borders. It would be established in the hearts of those who believed in me. I remember the entry into Jerusalem, riding on a donkey, while the people cried, "Hosanna to the Son of David." At that moment, the gold from the Magi came back to my mind. The crowd saw in me a political liberator, but my kingdom was not of this world. It was eternal, built upon love, truth, and sacrifice. The incense, with its sweet and heavenly fragrance, symbolized my connection to the Father. During my life, I was a bridge between the divine and the human. My prayers, miracles, and teachings were like the incense that rises to the heavens, a constant reminder that my life was a living offering. But the incense also carried the weight of intercession. Each person I healed, each soul I encountered, was a living prayer rising to the Father. This role as mediator between God and humanity was both an honor and a burden. And then there was myrrh. Bitter, dense, but profoundly significant. From the moment it was placed before me, I knew it pointed to sacrifice. Myrrh was not just a gift, it was a prophecy about the path I would walk. On the cross, When I gave up my spirit, I understood the full meaning of the gifts. The gold was the proclamation of my reign. The incense, the confirmation of my divinity. And the myrrh, the symbol of the sacrifice that brought redemption to the world. These gifts were not just for me. They continue to speak to every generation. The gold challenges you to recognize my sovereignty and allow me to reign in your life. The incense invites you to a constant connection with the Father, through prayer and worship. And the myrrh reminds you that even in pain, God can bring redemption. That night in Bethlehem, the Magi may not have fully understood the impact of their gifts, but their obedience made them part of an eternal story. And so, I leave a question. What gifts are you willing to bring? They don't need to be gold, incense, or myrrh. They could be your faith, your time, your life. Because, just like the Magi, you too can be part of something much greater.